Yeah, all looking good. Thanks. Okay, so we'll sort of get into the question. Just wanted to ask how much time you have. If you have a hard stop at 12 your time.
I'm good.
Okay, great. It's always worth knowing, we'll sort of, we've got about sort of 20 questions. We'll see how far we get, and hopefully we'll get through them. But kind of covering the themes of the book. So I'll kind of, without further ado, I'll just kind of start on the intro for Earth.org, and that'll be sort of the beginning of the interview proper from the podcast point of view.
Okay, super.
Excellent, thanks so much. So hi everyone. So quick introduction to Earth.org. Earth.org is an environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies for the protection of the natural environment and an extension of governance or oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org Talks, we are engaging with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience, all to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. So welcome. For our audience, I would like to welcome Andri Snær Magnason, writer, essayist, activist, and documentary filmmaker. Andri hails from Reykjavik, Iceland, and has authored several novels, plays, and children's books, in addition to co-directing a 2009 documentary adaptation of one of his books, receiving multiple awards and nominations for his literary work. His titles include Dreamland, The Casket of Time, Love Star, and The Story of the Blue Planet. In 2016, Andri ran for president of Iceland, with environmental issues at the forefront of his agenda, finishing third in the elections. His fascinating book, On Time and Water, was first published in Iceland in 2019, with an English language version released in 2020. The book has been shortlisted for the Nordic Council's 2021 Literary Award and is being released in over 30 languages. To start, Andri, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Your book is at its core about time and how our reactions and interpretations of it are changing. How does this concept of time connect to the environmental crisis?
Well, it has everything to do with it. How we are running out of time, how we are disconnected to time. That is, and I felt this was a big part of the problem, was all these scientific predictions of 2050, 70, 2100. It did not stir any reaction with us. It was like we were totally numb when it came to dates like that, and unable to take swift precautions or measures to prevent tragedy and catastrophe, which kind of our leading scientists had been pointing out. So there were many scientists that I met that were kind of desperate. That is, I really respect science and the expertise of scientists, and I didn't feel like I really had the authority to step into their game. But then the scientists told me people don't understand graphs, they don't understand the dates, they understand stories. So that's kind of how I got, you could say, confidence or permission to write about this.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that use of language and storytelling is one of the most sort of compelling aspects of the book. And just an opening sort of question: in your opinion, are we sleepwalking to a kind of hell on earth?
Yes, I think we are. Because we are damaging things in a very dramatic way, and so how nature has left geological speed of change and started to change on a human level. That is something that we can. I'm not sure I would say hell on earth in the whole planet, but I think we can create very hellish circumstances for a very wide group of humans. So it seems like if you ask, like Greta has been saying, we should treat this like a crisis. She says we should treat this like a crisis, and when you ask somebody, for example, how much trouble have you gone through to tackle the coronavirus? You know, what have you done? And people can name endless things, how they have prevented tragedy by quarantine, by governmental rules, by not traveling, by social distancing. Just people can infinitely name, you know, tens and dozens of things that they've done and just basically altered their lives. And then when you ask, okay, do you agree that in the long run, the global warming is a bigger issue and a much more difficult, much worse for future generations? Then, and I ask people, and what difficulties have you done for global warming compared to the coronavirus? And they think for a while, and they're like, well, I bought some green products, and I was like, yeah, okay. I bought a Tesla. I'm like, buying a Tesla is an upgrade. That's not discomfort. I don't feel sorry for you for buying a Tesla, and we can't expect that we can treat the greatest crisis that humanity has maybe collectively been faced with simple upgrades of a luxurious lifestyle, and without going through some 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years of actually feeling that we are changing something.
Could it be that in the case of COVID, there weren't so many vested interests fighting against that science? Whereas with climate change, there's huge amounts of vested interests that have been fighting a propaganda war for the last 30 years, counteracting and confusing the situation around climate change.
Yes, I think that in a few years, people in the oil industry or people, of course, these industries are all full of fine people, and we're all kind of interwoven with this system. But I think the people that have been leading kind of the misinformation, the campaigns, the knowing the science, like the most ruthless of the lobbying that has been going on, I think those people will really have to, they will have great trouble in their elderly years when I think international laws might come after them. I'm quite sure that the young generation will put laws and criminalize these actions in the most severe way in the future. But the problem with like the coronavirus, it's also a problem of imagination. That is, when Italy was burning, I remember when like all hell had broken loose in Italy, and people were like dying on the hallways. Still, life was normal in London. My son was studying in London, and the subways were full, and like and I called and said, hurry home, you know, things are gonna go very bad. And but in that situation, they were saying like, no, it's no problem, you know, nobody's worried. This is just some. It was like people could not translate Italy, the situation of Italy, into London 2 weeks later, which was just obvious, which was obviously going to happen. And this is a problem of imagination. And then of course we have huge interest groups that could have prevented the coronavirus, like the whole tourist industry, you know, basically huge industries, but of course the consequences were so immediate, and the hospitals and the crisis was so immediate that I think that's why we could respond to an immediate crisis, but it seems like we can slowly cook ourselves in this maybe longer term crisis.
There's something around the human psychology that in some cases it has to take personal experience before you really consider the risks or you consider the impacts. It's you know, in the case where you were saying with COVID, you know, only a matter of weeks, only a matter of a few hundred or 1,000 or so kilometers difference was enough for people to insulate themselves mentally from what the risks they were facing.
Yes, and I think, and that is the big problem. It's like if you don't believe somebody telling you that the snow is piling up in the mountain and there will be an avalanche soon, if you don't understand the avalanche until it's coming at you, you know, then why measure the snow piles? You know, why? So that is the problem, of course, of how we have undermined science, and maybe it's also an example of that we still do respect medical science, and scientists in medicine seem to have ability to kind of step in and gain authority, while climate science has been marginalized and environmental science has been like they've been more serving the industries rather than telling the industries what to do.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, that's a factor of the amount of money involved in those industries who have a permanent interest in maintaining, you know, the revenue flow. So there's such an economic weight of existing industries which are you know, kind of all powerful in this debate, and have been definitely muddying the waters and sowing confusion in terms of the scientific advice that's been coming through. So I think it's, as you said, there's a lot of people that are kind of very, very responsible and potentially in the future could be held accountable.
I'm quite sure they will be held accountable. That's inevitable, I think. So because the crime is probably the biggest collective crime against humanity and our existence that we've seen, and of course, people feel complicit. Living in the West, living in in these countries, and of course the benefit of oil, coal, and gas is real. That is, we are not 70% water; we are 90% oil, coal, and gas. That is, humanity. We would not be almost 8 billion if we hadn't benefited from this. But since 30 years ago, we could have radically reduced the amount of oil, coal, and gas that was burned without limiting the life of humanity and kind of our survival. Because of course, food production, transportation, construction, housing, just everything that surrounds us has of course been powered by the superpowers of these industries, and now we're faced with this enormous task of taking the foundations of what we are and shifting that to alternative energy sources, and that is a colossal project. It's like maybe in some ways like rebuilding Europe after the Second World War or something. It needs lots of effort and we need to divert lots of talent basically into that field, maybe by law, policy. It doesn't happen just gradually like buying a Tesla.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement, or as an organization, that it really has to be policy change that's required, you know, to drive this forward, and that it has to be long-term thinking in those policies that is more understand or cognizant, mindful of the impacts of the policies that we choose today. So we're, you know, like you, I think we believe that it really has to be dramatic reorganization of our societies and industries that will be the only way to get there, and that requires changes from the top that are kind of effectively imposed on society.
Yes, like because we've been focused on like plastic straws very much, or and also even flight shame. That is, but then we have. But then you're stuck in infrastructure. Like 40% of the problem is coming from construction and just heating and cooling buildings. So even though you stop flying and you start consuming, well, there's so much that we are stuck with in infrastructure of transportation, infrastructure of how you heat or cool your house. You can't really, most people can't really do that on their own incentives. They're living in apartment buildings or they're living in cities. They can't transform that by shame or by individual actions. So this is a huge collective thing, and actually, I think it should almost be seen as so basically transforming these systems is a collective thing. So actually, like Europe should almost look at Europe as a collective item, and just why is Spain not totally solar yet? You almost see no solar panels in Spain. So there's like you can just see that we have hardly started many initiatives where the lowest hanging fruits are to be found, and sometimes the initiatives are being done where they may be least efficient. So just pile up the solar panels and clean up Spain. I think we need a very I think we need both innovation in the private sector, but also very kind of firm governmental city scale infrastructure projects that just take one city at a time and just clean them up.
Yeah, almost the continental plan, and you mentioned the Marshall Plan as being a really good example, where huge amounts of resources were allocated and diverted into rebuilding Europe after the war, and I think that correlation, I think, is where we are at. And of course, the longer we leave it, the more dramatic that allocation of resources will need to be, therefore having impacts on human livelihood. So as you said, the window to do it with relatively mild, or in fact hardly even noticeable impacts 30 years ago is past, and now we're in a situation where impacts without a doubt will be felt by ordinary people in order for that reallocation to happen with sufficient resources behind it. So I'm very much with you on that. We'll probably touch on that in a little bit later, but just in your book on the connection of stories of your grandparents' experiences to scenes that your children will face. Children born today have a good chance to be alive in 2100, by which time, if we haven't changed our ways dramatically, the world will be in a very bad state. Your book shows that narratives or storytelling can be just as powerful a communicator, if not more so, than scary numbers and graphs.
Yes, so I was thinking, like, it's easy to write a book about climate change. Like I could write a book in a week, a linear journalistic retelling of the science. Just go through a IPCC report and put some fat of words, like understandable words around it. But what I was faced with was that, and was trying to do, was both in terms of storytelling and making things more personal, but also making people aware of language. That making people aware that, yes, you just read this word, but did you really understand the word? And what meaning does that word have for you? Like when I say the word ocean acidification, just to make people aware that culturally that word is almost empty as we speak. It was first mentioned like just more than maybe 15 years ago in Icelandic media, and it has hardly reached the front pages. It was never mentioned for most people's elementary schools or even universities. So culturally, this word has been meaningless. So how do you write about an issue where the language itself fails you? So the approach to the book, you can't take words for granted. You can't expect words to have impact. So my challenge was that the issue is kind of like a black hole. Is you can't really look straight into the black hole because it's so enormous that it swallows all meaning. When I say the word ocean acidification, the person listening to me do not think of all basically all the oceans of the planet, all the coral reefs, all the starfish, all the whales, all the seals and guillemots. It's like it doesn't contain the whole oceans, like a Japanese haiku is supposed to contain the whole oceans in a drop, but the word does not contain it. So I have to remind people that we are in a phase of humanity where we don't understand the word. And how do I explain that? I can go back to history and show people times, for example, in Iceland, when we did not understand the word freedom. We did not understand democracy, freedom, liberty, equality. We just basically had not understood the words of the French Revolution. We just believed that the norm was to have a king, and the norm for the people without power was to have no power, nothing to say over their lives. So to explain ocean acidification, I have to explain how we didn't understand the French Revolution, and how 100 years later it was like in every person's mind and everybody understood it. But then I have to explain also that we don't have 100 years to understand ocean acidification like we had to understand the concepts of the French Revolution until we became a democracy. And this goes to like the theory of Copernicus, that the sun was the center of our galaxy. And yeah, I was wondering if I found the right English word. So if the sun was the center of our solar system, and that took 100 years to understand. And then when it comes to glaciers and time, if somebody talks about a glacier in the year 2100, it doesn't mean so much for them. So I found that if I just visit my grandmother, and she was a glacial explorer, at times when the glaciers were eternal, they were in the context of eternity, then my grandmother, she was part of the group that was kind of mapping and measuring the Icelandic glaciers, the founding partners of the Icelandic Glacial Research Society. So there I could have like first-hand experience of the glaciers in the 50s, and real love and real stories about the glaciers. But then you can use this same grandmother as a measurement unit of time, because she's almost 100 years old. So I connect to her in the past, but actually she also makes a bridge into the future, because if I just warp my grandmother over the axis into the other direction, then I have my daughter sitting in her same kitchen in the year 2102. So I'm sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother in at that time 2018, and we're calculating how she might be sitting in this same kitchen in the year 2102 with a child that might be born 2090, and measuring how long will that child remember my daughter, and still be telling stories about my daughter. And they come up with 2172, even 2180, when somebody will still be talking about my daughter as his or her greatest influence in their lives. So basically, talking about climate change by not talking about climate change, the problem with words like ocean acidification, it's disconnected to all culture, disconnected to even the oceans, disconnected to whales, disconnected to grandmothers, disconnected to Beatles, Napoleon. It's just a empty, lonely word, disconnected to anything. And the role of art is to take a word like that and connect it and load it.
Yeah, I think your stories, although seemingly simple, really have that effect in terms of bringing the story home, and it touches on that whole question of the intergenerational responsibility that we have, that every generation should have for future generations, which today is being ignored?
Yeah, these are like super simple stories. Actually, I'm not a great philosopher. I don't use very big words. it's, it's more like kind of going through very simple observations about it's just this, like, about language, just asking almost childish questions. I hear this word. Why do I not understand it?
Yeah.
I was also like inspired by, was it Descartes, that was just sitting in his living room wondering where he starts and where he ends. If he didn't have hands, would he still be himself? If he didn't have legs, would he still be himself? What was himself? And in a similar way, just thinking, what does this word mean? Does it mean anything? Is it useful? In a similar way, when is someone still alive that you will love? Where do I end in the memory of someone? Like, when is somebody still telling stories about me? Or when am I still telling stories about my grandmother? So our time is the time of the people that we know and love, the time that creates us, versus the time of the people that we will know and love, the time that we create. So I can touch 1924 with my bare hands by just visiting my grandmother, and I might be able to reach up to 2150 when somebody that might be directly influenced by my love and care will be out there. And the sincere idea is to make us feel responsible for 2150, not as a scene for dystopia, but I call it pancake sci-fi, that it doesn't matter what technology is out there, what kind of, basically the only thing that matters is that we live in a stable, peaceful societies within a biosphere, and living with other beings on this planet in some kind of harmony. And that's what I call pancake sci-fi, that we have succeeded if you can just sit in this same kitchen as my grandmother in the year 2150, and my daughter's grandchild can share stories about her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, switching tack just for a second, the on the kind of more technical point, you made a very powerful point, and I think this is something that, in terms of that glacial time, in terms of how impacts can be hidden for so long. You made a point that it's only when a glacier essentially all but disappears that the summer melt flow stops, and it's only at that point, which literally could be within only noticeable in the last few years, that the people downstream will really notice that difference. And until that point, in fact, there's a kind of false hope, because actually water flows increase in the summer, and then suddenly they reverse. So it's something that we've seen, and you've talked about, there's already been seen in Icelandic glaciers, but also in some high mountain glaciers.
Yeah, that's kind of the devious thing. That while glaciers are melting, you could cause or create false prosperity, which is almost like when you're emptying your bank account or something, instead of saving. So in some places you can have more water while the glaciers are being emptied out. For example, the Icelandic energy companies, they have been talking about how they can kind of retrofit their existing power plants to capture this extra amount of water that is coming while the glaciers are melting, and then eventually when they're gone, or they have like reached this downhill slope of being so small they don't sustain big rivers anymore, then suddenly nobody really knows what will go into these dams, or what kind of rivers will be flowing there. So especially for the Himalayas and these regions where that relies so much on the glaciers capturing the monsoon and releasing the water during the dry season, there might be, abundant water while the glaciers are melting at this alarming rate that could benefit some crops and some cities. But then eventually, when it goes over the tipping point or goes over the curve, then suddenly you go from prosperity to scarcity. And that is a very kind of devious situation and a big problem. And so the melting of glaciers in Iceland are not maybe a great worry for Icelanders. We have so much water. But if you look at the Himalayas, where they're basically the life veins, the frozen cows of those civilizations, basically feeding 1 billion people, then you can foresee lots of possible problems.
Yeah, I think that's quite scary, especially when you consider there are 3 nuclear powers that surround the Himalayas and Tibetan plateaus that depend on this sort of water for this cycle of freezing and melting that has been so consistent up until now, but now which is going into an inconsistent, unsustainable pattern that will eventually have kind of dramatic impacts.
Yeah, and they believe that at least 30% of the Himalayan glaciers will be reduced in the until the end of this century, according to the Hindu Kush reports, and that, while these populations are increasing, the trend of water is going the other direction. That is a very alarming fact, and where places are already having difficulty with water or extreme heat waves. So you can foresee very big geopolitical consequences of this happening. And if that part of the world starts shaking, of course the whole world shakes with it, because nobody's unharmed if 1 billion people are in some kind of turmoil. Yeah. So I was also thinking this fine balance between alarmist and like seeing the worst predictions, but it seems like we have to be extremely lucky if we are going to sail this all like tackle this all in a peaceful manner. People have to be very strong politically to share scarce water and allow water to flow over the border if you're already having scarcity within your own borders. So this will be a huge challenge for the politics and the how these nations are going to share these resources in the future.
Returning to Iceland, you famously wrote the dedication for the Ökjökull Glacier in Iceland on a copper plate at the monument, which has the following words: "OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our main glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it." This dedication ends with the date of the ceremony and the concentration of the carbon dioxide in the air globally at 415 parts per million at that date. Do you think we should be marking or bringing attention in similar ways to more of the tragic historical events that are unfolding, to remind ourselves what's happening and what will continue happening unless we dramatically change our ways, the way we organize our societies and the way we consider and interact with nature?
Yes, I was asking myself this question. This idea of the glacier memorial came from professors in anthropology in Texas, and they initiated this project, and it was an interesting idea, because when did climate change happen? When did glaciers start melting? Like, where were the big events of climate change? And it seems like in this slow cooking phase. It's like it never started and it never happened, but it was always happening everywhere. And I've actually seen that my text has been used at least 2 or 3 times more on lost glaciers. I think I saw it in Mexico and I saw it in France. So this has become some kind of a thing of saying goodbye to glaciers with a monument. And at the same time, you wonder, you know, how do we memorize the coral reefs? How do we memorize parts of the Amazon? So I think it's maybe important for us to remind ourselves that things are not okay, things are not normal. Not to normalize things, always step back and say, okay, we should not accept that this is happening, and what can we do to prevent further damage? So that is something that I think you know, we could put all sorts of milestones on, but also celebrate progress and good ideas.
Yeah, let's hope we have more of those good ideas in the future. And as the speed of change begins to eclipse geological time, are environmental crises such as climate change and biodiversity loss beginning to transcend political and ideological boundaries to become more universally recognized existential threats?
Yeah, it's I think you know, like, I think also we will probably see a paradigm shift in the next very few years, where you know, the issue will probably start moving from activist, you could say activist left, to just becoming almost like something that governments tackle, like just like when they established the military or something. This will become like a central. It starts with the cities. So the cities are already, like, it doesn't matter if you have a left or right city. The cities of the world are very much on it. Many of them in tackling climate change, but it seems like national governments have been a bit behind. And also industries, I think, because industries of course, yes, they are corporations, but they're also people. And I think the new generation will not find it tasteful to just enter business as usual. It will not be seen, just like it was kind of frowned upon when somebody went into nuclear. I knew a person that was running a nuclear plant, and he was saying it was difficult and even dangerous because they were not getting talent anymore to run the nuclear facilities. While in the 60s, the greatest talents of that generation was going into nuclear. I'm not going to put this into the nuclear discussion, but I think the same trends will happen, that the minds of the generation born, you know, 2000 to 2010 will find their talents are wasted if they are not addressing this issue. And it will be kind of frowned upon if you enter a very high carbon field, or without having the intentions of limiting that. So when I talk to young people, it's difficult to frame the situation because, of course, it's apocalyptic, and you don't really want to, and nobody really knows eventually how things will play out. But as it seems now, business as usual will be very destructive. But I tell them it's not essentially, and that's part of the storytelling in the book, that if you look at the story of your grandparents, you know, you were not lucky to be born in Europe 1910, and you were not lucky to be born in Europe in 1930 either. So each generation has had challenges and difficulties to overcome, and as a response to these challenges and difficulties, we have made things and recreated things and created institutions. So basically, if you're a young person today, all your working life is about this issue. That is, if you enter construction, if you enter transportation, tourism, agriculture, design, fashion, it just does not matter what field you enter. You basically have to revolutionize that field, or even go into a field just to phase it out. So basically, all aspects of industry, everything that we kind of can see today, has to be rethought and redesigned. And while you're not maybe running away from the wildfire, when we're still having some kind of stable societies, then that doesn't have to be a super negative challenge, because like 20 years ago, it was not seemed cool to go into waste disposal. Now you can see young people studying to go into waste management, and they're like some poster from the Soviet Union. They're like, like I'm going into waste disposal because there's so much to do, and they're so enthusiastic, and they're so upbeat about the possibilities and the change that they can do almost instantly, in many cities and in many aspects of industry. So there is, these challenges are also giving more value to lots of jobs that have been invisible for the last 30 years, maybe, because there's so much that needs to be changed and so much innovation that is needed, that it's not like you're going into the workforce with the dread that you're not needed and that everything is on cruise control. Basically, everything is done wrongly, and you basically have to revolutionize every single field. So that does not have to be super negative. And then when you have changed things, you don't really miss the 2020s, because you just look at the 2020s like some barbaric age. When you have changed from our worst habits, then you'll just look at what we've been doing, our cars, our food waste, our trash heaps, and they'll just shake their heads and like, what intellect was going on there. So I'm optimistic in that way, that as soon as, again, just like as soon as we go over the curve, now we don't really see we don't see CO2 going down yet properly, but you can be hopeful that as we get over the curve, that things might start happening faster than we maybe anticipated.
Yeah, I think we all hope for that, and we all hope for the application of huge amounts of economic resources if the right incentives were created. Perhaps there's a carbon price, perhaps there's some other incentives which incentivize the allocation of capital into making these improvements, along with legislation and so on. So it's I think that the energy of humans can very quickly make big changes if they're organized and motivated in the same direction. It could be absolutely dramatic, the changes that can be achieved in a 20-year, 30-year time frame.
With basically a few billion people aligned in the wrong direction. But you could imagine if we start going in the other direction, that things, I want to believe that we can do these things, and I don't want to be cynical, at least not yet.
Yeah.
And I base that also on science, that according to, it's a very narrow window, but I also believe that the story of scarcity, and even though I want to motivate people by saying all hell will break loose and the world is going to burn, I'm not sure if the response will be innovation or social progress. It could just as well be some kind of like the millionaire, like could be some bunker mentality, that is just buy guns and stack the bunker with cans. So you could imagine that, for example, when we finally start scaling up solar energy and wind energy, wind and and even thermal energy. That because we've just neglected that. So these are just still marginal energy resources and are just kind of on the first phase of development, really. If you look at the century in the big picture, then you can imagine that, like northern part of Africa, which has all this sun, all this heat, that we could even have cities, something like a solar Saudi Arabia. That is, in 100 years, that we could have cities that are basically based on that abundance of energy that can be used to power, heat, cool, grow, desalinate. So if you look at how the cell phone has reached, Africa before the landline hit Africa. So the phase of everybody going first through the coal plant and through the superhighway, that everybody has to develop through the same mistakes as the West did, and China, much of China. So if you imagine the rest of the world going out of poverty, maybe through solutions that will be scaled up in the next 20, 30 years, then you can also be positive at how maybe poverty, etc., can be erased without, like China did, building 1,000, putting up 100 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere.
If the transformation of our energy systems would take investments of around 2 to 2.5% of GDP per year, which is about the same as defense, why aren't we doing it?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's I think again we're in. I think it's because we're raised in this neoliberal era of the 80s and 90s, where governments were not supposed to do things. The military spending that we have normalized today is, I think, a consequence, or at least the things that they spend on are a consequence of the Second World War, and where you could actually defend against an enemy that was on the other side of the border. But in this case, we're facing with a race where either everyone wins or everyone loses. That is, if humanity does not win this race together, it doesn't matter if Iceland becomes clean or an island or Europe or something. If the world does not collectively work on this issue. So after the Second World War, we had the United Nations, where people came to a single room that was unthinkable that they could even speak together, and people put aside so much slaughtering. There was so much reason for revenge in a single room in the United Nations that you could, you just imagine everybody had a brother or a family member that had died in conflict, and suddenly people were sitting at a table. So I think, so the United Nations was a result of a huge tragedy, and probably our generation has to, and the next generation has to make something. And this military, this aviation, these navies, air forces, all this stuff was kind of created in the Second World War. This didn't exist before, and probably we just have to see different kinds of infrastructures that governments make collectively. So yeah, like in the 80s and 90s, the governments were not supposed to take on big infrastructure projects, and lots of the energy companies are private, lots of the oil companies are private, and there are lots of private interests in this. And while I believe in innovation and what the private sector can do, in this case, we need just probably a swift 5% of GDP, where we basically divert resources, talent by hand into this energy transformation. And of course, there will be lots of mistakes and some stupid actions, but in the big picture, 2 to 5% of the GDP does not sound it sounds hilarious, actually, if it is actually true that the amount is so low. I read that in some scientific papers, and I can hardly believe that it's only 2 to 5% to transform the energy systems. It's even if it was 10%, 15%, 20%, because every single current job is worthless if we don't really fix this problem. In hindsight, all our toil will have been worthless. So just taking a war effort for 5 or 10 years would be appropriate against this problem.
Agreed.
Melting pots and pans and making solar panels, something like that. It's like, and like I said with the Tesla, it's like we believe that we can transition this without ever feeling, that we have to wait for a car for 2 years or something, like because while they're making the solar panels, you can't buy a new, or at least the size of a car will be limited until we've just gone over this hill. That would be an appropriate kind of situation, because but it's just showing that we're not prioritizing resources yet to this issue.
Absolutely. In the you wrote the book in early 2019, I think, or 2018, 2019.
Yeah, so it's written since 2010 to 19. Yeah. So it was took quite a long time to get it through.
I noticed that you rather presciently stated that forests in Australia, America, the Amazon, and the Nordic countries will erupt into flame. In 2019, of course, that's exactly what happened, and also 2020 and subsequent years. This is happening with kind of frightening frequency, and as scientists predicted. And I think even in Australia alone, I read today that the cost of the Australian bushfires, which they call the Black Summer, is estimated to be over 100 billion Australian dollars in property damage and economic losses, let alone the billion animals that died. So even the economic costs of climate change today, relatively, to make no sense, even to the value, to the cost of transforming our industries and our economies. So it's even as though the economics today don't make any sense, i.e. that we're being completely illogical in the cost that we're facing in the present, let alone the costs in the future.
Yeah, it's also I noticed that basically the field of economy just did not seem to be very literate on ecology, and the studies of ecology were the confidence of economy of predicting and telling how things should be done versus the confidence of ecologists that would always say, well, there's uncertainty, we need more research. It was like stone, scissors, paper. It was like economy would always win. And of course, it's when people are talking about, like, I think it's in the bill in the States, can we afford, I didn't put down the numbers, but it was like, I think it was like $1 trillion or something versus military spending that was like 1,000 times more or something. It was just a very minor thing. It's like people still live in this unreality that some kind of economy exists unrelated to Earth, unrelated to oceans, glaciers, water resources, forests, habitat. That there's something called economy that can continue running after we have lost that. And there's just some fundamental flaw that is in the discussion of, can we afford, an X amount into climate, into the climate sector? It's like, it's treated like an issue. It's treated like it's not treated like people really understand that they are talking about the fundamentals. That if they do not fix these fundamentals, then everything else will fail. And it's maybe a generational thing. I think it's also, when I look at these politicians in America, maybe in their 60s and 70s, they are like the peasants of Iceland that did not understand freedom and equality in the year 1809. It's just that you can just clearly see that they don't really understand what is happening. And I think maybe that doesn't come until this Greta generation, this climate strike generation of people that really understand the year 2070 as an intimate date of their existence. And I think the generation that is now at power, I have this strange theory, I'm not sure if it can be, that most of us feel like 1970 was 30 years ago. I asked my friend, do you agree 1970 was 30 years ago? And he said, yes, of course. And I said, what do you mean? It's 50 years ago. And he said, oh my God, 50 years ago. Yes. And I said, like, yes, it's 50 years ago. You are 50. You should know, you're born 1970. You should, isn't it obvious for you? And he said, no, it was not obvious for me. So we have all sorts of strange detachments in our minds. And I think that just like my grandfather, he never understood the Beatles. You know, he was still only in his 40s when the Beatles came. No, he was in his 50s. He was in his 50s when the Beatles came, and you would think you could, you know, listen to new music, but he was always singing the songs from the 30s. And in a strange way, I think our generation and the ruling generation does not really feel the new century has started. That we were raised with the year 2000 culturally kind of tattooed in our mind as a future, far future. And it's like we have never been able to really intimately connect to 2070. But you know, like my daughter is 72. No, she's my daughter is 62 in the year 2070. She's not even in her pension years. And so of course we put all our resources. No job is worth working, no resource is worth using if we can calculate that resource is only used to destabilize the planet. So every car is worthless if we haven't found out how to make that vehicle unharmful to my daughter when she's 62. So basically, we're in this very strange situation where all our actions, all our industries, all our economies, I think we sincerely want to move the world forward. And when we make a hospital, we believe that we're making the world better for our children. When we build schools, when we build roads. But now we're in this impossible dilemma where everything that we're doing is basically harming our own children. And that is a very difficult situation. And we will be confronted very soon by these same children in some kind of a generational standoff, because they won't think we have been wise for the last 30 years.
Yeah, if not longer. Like you, I was born in the 70s, and you know, I remember climate change or carbon emissions being the maths of carbon being even discussed in the 70s. And then, you know, it looked as though there was some sort of consensus politically being formed until the 80s, 90s, and then it all started to go wrong in a very bad way. And at the same time, China was rising and contributing gigantic amounts of new emissions alongside other emerging countries without sort of forethought as to the combined impact of pre-existing carbon contributions that modern societies in the West had made, plus the new societies that were emerging, was just too much. And it came up very, very quickly into a situation where we are today, which is where you look at the maths and at 415 ppm, you've got a very bad situation already.
Yes, and that's what I was looking at when I was writing my book Dreamland. Like in 2000, aluminum production of the world was like I think it was like 30 million tons. In 2005, it was like 30 million tons in 2005, and it had gradually reached those 30 million tons in 100 years, like since the dawn of aluminum production. And then they were predicting that that amount would double in the next 15 years. And that was presented as positive. That is, the very damaging impact of 100 years would be imposed on the planet in 15 years. And then that happened. And that is, of course, the reason why we feel things are shaking now, is because in the last 15 years, we basically doubled our impact. We took 100 years of impact and squeezed that into 15 years. And in cement construction, steel, aluminum, basically raw material, plastics. And I think that is why we are feeling how things are shaking now. So the bad habits of the West, before they could be phased down, they were implanted or duplicated in China, and also we could see that things that had been banned in the West or phased out in the West, they were taken to the developing countries, because there they could use the machines or the knowledge, the damaging knowledge that had been kind of shoved out of the West was just taken to new places. And also I was in China once, in Chengdu, and I was kind of astonished how much of a car city was being created. They were just crushing down everything and making super highways everywhere. And I met this person working for I think Bombardier, the train manufacturer, and basically he was telling me how contractors that build these super highways, how the motor companies, like how leaders of cities in China were being wined and dined and kind of sold these mega solutions of car infrastructure. And I was like, such a shame that this moment in history was happening. And because I always thought that China was thinking 200 years ahead, and then it was just, oh no, they're just people. They're just like vain, and they just want something on strange, maybe because of strange reasons.
I think, yeah, the question of long-termism in leadership is such a good question. I think we often ask, and we often think, would are countries like China with its long-term economic planning in a better position to consider the environmental consequences of its actions relative to the short cycles of democracies and the lack of incentives that democratic leaders have to implement long-term planning, because they basically have no incentives. They're not rewarded if they take brave decisions today, which take 10 years or 15 years to show themselves in terms of the benefits. And do you see any hope that democracies can employ or weave into their structures the ability to think long-term?
Well, democracy has kind of brought us all sorts of rights, human rights and women rights, and I think, yes, we are of course having this big challenge of hindsight. Was democracy a good idea or not? That is, are we only stuck in this instant gratification of the four-year term, and are we sensible enough to actually take measures and even go through some kind of difficulties to achieve something in the long run? I can't really answer that, but it doesn't seem still like China is doing very well in this direction, at least in terms of the environment. And so I sincerely want to believe that if we look at the history of paradigm shifts, that at least the Western democracies are on kind of the brink of a paradigm shift of understanding this crisis as an existential threat of a whole generation. And that generation will not vote against its own interests. And I think we will see much more radical activism on behalf of the young people, like the Extinction Rebellion. I think we will see much more direct action and much kind of stronger activities pushing our democracies faster into the right direction. And I think that will happen, and that needs, for that you need protests, and you need marches, activism, sit-ins, and maybe some direct action. But I think that change will be probably more swift in the Western countries.
Yeah, at least initially. And I think the activism of the young, it's as you said, it's both able to cut through perhaps some of this language issue by just bringing home the intergenerational responsibility and the theft that's effectively happening from future generations by today's people alive today, who are enjoying lifestyles and certain activities which are incredibly damaging and potentially threatening to future generations. That equation, I think, is something which the actions of youth activists can bring home or communicate quite effectively.
I think we should not underestimate. We have young people, just like last week. We had young people in dozens of cities that were on stage addressing 100,000 peers. Who of my generation had stood on stage to address 100,000 people in a city square about something with high values and importance and urgency? I don't think, maybe during the anti-nuclear bomb rallies or something, but basically, I don't think my generation has anybody with as much political experience as we will find with the young climate kids that are now all over the world, and they're very connected, and they're also collective in a way that they're using this new technology, so they're very globally connected as well. So if I want to have some optimism, then and I'm not saying that the young people should clean up the mess, but I just think if you look at the history of how ideas are better understood by those that are born into an area where the idea is already established, rather than when you hear the idea in your 30s, and then this generation that just went through the draconian measures of the coronavirus, where basically big sectors of the economy were slashed and burned or stopped or diverted for a higher cause. This generation lost their best years of high school to isolation and which is a huge sacrifice and a huge mental challenge for a whole generation. And I think they will look at using 5% of GDP to transform energy systems like a very small, something very small compared to staying indoors for a year, or not going to parties or not celebrating birthdays. So it's basically, okay, so you're saying that instead of building big cars, you're going to make windmills and solar panels for 10 years? That's nothing compared to not hugging grandmothers. That's nothing to not meeting friends for a year, not going on a summer vacation. It's like they will see that challenge, this 2.5%, 5%, maybe 10% that we need to basically divert of the economy. They will see this as a small thing compared to losing 2 years of their best life, 2 of their best years in their life from 16 to 18 or something. And I think they will also say, we did this for you, the older generation. Now you just behave and just help us do this. I'm hoping that that will be the narrative that we will go into, because this generation just got the biggest metaphor that any generation has received in terms of shared experience. And they've seen Operation Lightspeed of the vaccines. They've seen, they have the climate crisis in their 70s. That is within their own, they're paying into pension funds to be paid in 2070, basically. And so these future dates are cutting so close to them that I think we will see a paradigm shift in the next 2-3 years. We'll have a big setback in the next 1 or 2 years where everybody pretends we can go back to normal, but then I think this generation will have filled the universities and entering the workforce. And just like in the Me Too movement, where the young generation sets the rule for the older, this will happen again in this case. The young people will set the rules for the older generation. And when the older generation complains, then they'll say, we just sacrificed high school for you guys. Stop whining and go tend your garden or something.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, there are financial costs, there are emotional costs, and there are, life connection costs that I think COVID has highlighted. And as you said, very well, when you're not wedded to a certain, when you're not in a certain type of job, when you're when you're older, grown up, and you have already invested a good part of your working life into a certain kind of belief structure, it's quite difficult to, I think, to sort of have that, to contemplate that could be really undone. But I think when you're young, you don't have that baggage, you don't have that same framework that sort of can take away. What I mean by this is that adults build around them a framework which can incentivize conservative behavior, whereas youth don't have that framework yet. And I, as you said, what the big hope is, and I think we can do everything we can for this generation that's coming into the workforce and making itself more meaningful from a voter collective point of view, should be encouraged.
Yeah.
On that aspect, you ran for president. What did that teach you about president of Iceland? What did that teach you about the political realities of climate change and biodiversity loss?
Well, the president of Iceland is more like the president of Germany and I think Italy. That is, he's more like a figure, and normally he's not connected to a political party. So it's actually negative if he's too affiliated to a certain political party. So I basically ran because I thought if Iceland, has a figure that is still going and meeting heads of states all around the world, and I had all this climate information in my mind, and I was already lecturing for big groups of people, and I thought, okay, if the Icelandic president is supposed to talk about anything, he should talk about ocean acidification, glacial melting, and basically try to escalate the political understanding of the issue and bring science to power, bring science to people, and basically kind of try to escalate the change. This was before Greta came out, and my ideas were seen a bit too radical in the rural areas. I was seen as a lazy intellectual, and the global warming talk was not very, it did still bring it into the discussion of the election. So I got 25% in Reykjavik. What I got from this personally was I respect more people, regardless of political parties, that actually run for office. It's a very difficult thing to put. I'm a writer, so I'm used to the anxiety of book reviews and book sales, or just being in the public and trying to get attention or something. But it's very different when you put your own character on the scale and ask people to judge you personally. So I go into that game of being elected or not elected. So I actually respect more, and I'm not as harsh at politicians anymore on social media, calling them stupid assholes or something. I respect people, and basically I say, if you don't like the politics, run for office. That's, you asked for this system. Don't just complain in your corner. If you want things to change, go and change them. And that's what I kind of learned from it. But also, but at that time, I felt like we were too far behind. That in 2016, my ideas were seen just not relevant. I think they might be more now, but it was also an escape from a writer's block. So instead of hoping that my book would reach presidents, I could just skip the middleman. I could just take the information straight to heads of state. But eventually, I did not win, so I had to finish the book, and here it is.
It's a good idea, and if only more people with that intent, went into politics, I think it would be a better place. I think, as you said, in democracies, being in politics comes with quite high costs, in terms of, and it's quite off-putting, especially around the character. And I think social media has probably amplified that effect, where it is potentially a kind of a off-putting route for anyone with aspirations to make an impact. It's and potentially people choose other routes to make that impact.
Yeah, social media can be quite toxic, and this was before fake news also. So this was just before Trump ran. So the term fake news did not exist. But I had a incident of fake news that was used against me. I had been maybe not pleasant to some industrial interests in Iceland, especially, and so there were some people that did not want me to win. So there were some groups that were working against me, and social media can be very toxic for politics, because people are, even the politician you don't really like, he is still vulnerable, and it can be very difficult for people to be in office. But I've seen, I think, in the book of Cristina Figueres, one of the solutions to the climate crisis is run for office, and that is actually something that I advise people to try. Just run for anything if you because we should celebrate democracy. We should not stigmatize people as ecocentric for running for office. We asked for this system, and we should participate with.
Yep.
We should celebrate it. It's the elections should be a carnival of people wanting to participate and run for office, and we should celebrate everybody that runs, or at least respect them in some way. But of course, some people have ideas and agendas that I very despise. So I'm not saying that we should be good to all of them, but basically, for 90% of politics, people are, I think, wanting to do their best.
Just a few final questions, if we're okay for time. You mentioned, we already touched on this the pancake scene, of in your final chapter of your book, where you've described this scene, and we did touch on it earlier, but you regard success if we're able to do a simple seam that in the future, how hopeful are you that this future scenario will come to pass?
I think we will probably see lots of. It's almost inevitable that we will face lots of consequences of our actions during the last 30 years, and especially the last 20 years of basically this. And if you look at data about how much we need to build during the next 30 years, I think we need to build a city of 1.5 million people every week over the next 30 years to house an extra 2 billion people. So the challenges of the next 30 years are huge. And I think we don't really understand that habits that were created in the 70s or 60s, when humans were maybe 3 billion, that there is just not space for all that consumption of meat or the weight of our cars or transportation. So I think, but still, I have seen still science again that has measured that a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of calories, a certain amount of shelter is actually available for all humans within the limits and boundaries of the planet. So if we have a whole generation that their whole working life is about finding this balance the next 30 years, and if we see a similar transition into this direction as we've seen with human rights and women's rights, etc. So basically, if the next 30 years are all going the right direction, and if progress in clean technology is like my home phone in 1990 versus my cell phone today. So if this fine balance of technology, progress, policy, social innovation, when people ask me, what's the right thing? Is it planting trees or is it carbon capture? I think it's both. I think it's when we have 1,000 gigatons in the atmosphere, then we need progress in carbon capture and we need progress in rewilding and planting. So I still want to be hopeful. I still don't want to go into some kind of vision of some kind of a slum Earth. That's one scenario that some scientists have seen. Just basically go to some slum somewhere, and that's how we will be, and for most parts of humanity. But I still want to believe that we will solve this plastic crisis, this energy crisis, and that we will see disadvantages turned into advantages, just like Iceland. I don't see things linearly. You could say that you could see, like I was saying that will we have solar cities somewhere around North Africa or like are we only emptying out places because of global warming refugees? Or while we develop the ability to capture sun and heat and turn that into our advantage, will that help to ease some of those foreseeable issues that will come up? So I think we both overestimate and underestimate the future. That is, we overestimate the short-term results, but maybe we underestimate when a whole generation has reached their 50s with a totally different mindset of what to eat, how to dress, what is appropriate, and that the change will come faster than we maybe imagined.
Yeah, it's something that's it's easier to understand that when you look back to the past, and as you said, you can look at examples where there's been such dramatic changes in some industries, in some science, in some technologies, in working patterns that you could not have imagined, in the 20s. You couldn't have imagined the sort of lives that we have today. So if we're able to and potentially accelerate those changes, but in the right direction, then I'm with you in thinking that hugely impactful changes can be made, and actually for the better. And in which case, humans can be better off with these changes that can come into place. The big question is whether humans can be the same or better off, or at the same time as whether the biodiversity can survive in to any great degree. And I suppose the $1 million question is whether we get that balance right.
I think we have also examples of how places have bounced back. Of course, it's very difficult now when basically all nature is shifting, and it's sort of like suddenly a forest on this latitude is finding itself wrongly placed. So that is so enormous. I was also thinking about time, like I was in Spain with this Roman aqueduct over my head, and that was built in the year 100 after Christ, and it's a huge structure. And I was thinking, just like I was thinking of this 700-year-old book that I held in my hands, it's like, if this aqueduct will be here, has reached half its life, it might still be here in the year 4000. So just imagine how like 2000 years ago, 2000 years into the future. So it could just also well be that we might have a very difficult 100 years. That is just very possible. That while I'm hoping we will solve this within our lifetime, maybe we will just have a very difficult 100 years, while the long-term solutions will be found, or some balance will be found. But I want to believe that we have seen how forests have been regrown in 30 years. We have seen how trends of habits have changed very fast. And we've seen also, so I want to believe that when the mindset shifts, that it will happen faster than we anticipated. And like that's and also what I think is that nothing is useless. That is every action really counts, because it's about how we are. So even though we only reach half of the climate targets, then that was still worth reaching half of the climate targets rather than not reaching them. That is even reaching place 30 in the race was better than not participating in the race. That is, but still, like I say, we're still not in the paradigm shift. You can still see there is no cap on how much CO2 any individual anywhere in the world can emit personally. There is no tax on carbon. There's just there's nothing. So when the coronavirus mentality paradigm will be mirrored upon this crisis, we might see more draconian measures on what we are allowed to do and we've seen it also with the courts of Germany, like how the Supreme Courts have basically told that we know what is happening, and because we know what is happening, that means that we don't have permission to cause harm to next generations deliberately. So that is coming also into the law, not as and like when I met sustainability students 10 years ago, they were kind of the soft students. They were kind of they were used in big offices to make green trash bins or something. So they were kind of the soft, maybe makeup. But now those same students, they are coming to make the policy. So now they're dominating. Now they're going from being, instead of putting trash cans within the company, they're actually reaching policy where they're saying, can this company exist or not? Or what are the limits that this company can exist within? So that is going from soft science, or from the soft field, into becoming the hard, determining field of the limits of corporations and etc. So I can see it already, just since I started talking 10 years ago to students, from how they saw themselves into where they are now in policymaking, from being like their peers were saying, oh, you just went into the soft science, into those same peers needing to align themselves towards that soft knowledge, or former soft knowledge.
Yeah, it's something that, as you said, affects every single job going forward. It affects every single industry going forward. You know, my nephews, nieces that they're entering the workforce, this is something, you know, we talk about constantly, that the jobs will be different. Jobs existing will need, industries will need transformation. Everything will need to change, and that's something which I think is both a challenge and opportunity, but it's also a, you know, somewhat of a race in terms of us needing to do it soon, and this side of 2050.
There was a quite sweet story. I met the climate strike kids in a Swiss town called Bellinzona, and there was one boy. He was learning to be a train driver, and I had never met a train driver before. And I told him that, and he said everybody made fun of him because he wanted to be a train driver since he was 10, and everybody made fun of him for wanting this strange job like 10 years ago. But now it's a very cool thing to want to be a train driver. So lots of values of what you want to do in terms of work are changing, because another friend of his that maybe wanted to make a Ferrari or something, it's more ethical to want to be a train driver than to make Ferraris. So he was finding confidence also in different places. But I think that but I basically think that we are slowly coming to understanding. Of course, a bit too late, but again, it often happens also in humanity that swift changes are possible. Like Europe was rebuilt after the Second World War in just a few years. So we've seen that, you know, things can happen fast also.
Thank you, Andri. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us and Earth.org's audience. It's been a fascinating talk, and I hope that we'll get a chance to speak again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Very nice meeting you.
Thank you.